Yeah, welcome to our LCRL Liberty Alert live presentation. Today we're going to get it in just a minute, but today we're going to be talking about, so if you got here a little bit early, today we are going to be talking about the faith perspective, the faith mindset that we have to have going forward. So, now is the time to actually start to say, well, what are we supposed to be doing as two kingdom citizens as we move forward in the middle of this pandemic? Okay? All right, so faith, not fear. Just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going to go with this today, faith is not just, faith has knowledge involved with it. It's prayerful. It has a mindset that of the context of this COVID-19. It's not the biggest issue we're going to be facing, but it is a significant one. So faith is more than just going to church. It's a whole mindset of how to live life and how to move into these kinds of things, and we're going to unpack that today. But if you're going to talk about that faith mindset, it's a two-kingdom citizenship mindset. Now, why? Because the Bible says this is how God engages the world. God engages the world two different ways. To preserve it, that's his left-hand kingdom, and to save it, and he does that through the person and work of Jesus alone and offers it by grace through faith to anybody as a gift. But his left-hand kingdom work is what we're dealing with right now, that preserving of a sinful world so it doesn't go over the edge and chaos ensues. And he does that through outward use of the law, conformity to his law. And remember, the law is written on every human heart. So this is a message that actually does resonate. There are still consciences in every human heart, even if they violate those consciences. And so again, it's that you were taught this in your catechism class. The first use of the law is to curb outward behavior. Even if people's hearts weren't in it, you were going to say, yeah, but you're not going to do that. You may even think but you're not going to do that activity. It's destructive to you. It's destructive to our community. It's destructive to God's 10 Commandments, and you're not going to do that. So that curbing aspect is what we're talking about. And so as we get involved in people's lives and involved in the cultural debates, these are questions of morality and ethics, and we have every right to have our voice as part of that. And so when we think about that voice, two kingdom citizenship says, our First Amendment, it protects that voice. It protects our public voice. But it doesn't define our voice. It doesn't limit our voice. But it actually compels our voice. It says, hey, if you're going to have these protections, then you need to exercise your voice for the sake of the common good. And that's two kingdom citizenship in action. Then sanctified common sense. One of the things we're going to talk about today is, we're starting to get this notion that science and government, well, that's all we need to solve this crisis. That is flat out wrong. Now, we're not anti-science, by the way. And that's knowledge, but it doesn't give us all the knowledge we need as to how to move forward in caring for our neighbor. I'll talk about this in a minute. Where are the survival of the fittest people right now? Where are they? This whole thing about mercy and about caring for the individual, that comes more out of a Christian mindset of the fact that we believe all people are created in God's image. Even if they don't measure up to that image, we still have to deal with that inherent dignity that they have. So again, this sanctified common sense is key. And don't tell me that people are just dealing with the science. The science is being politicized and misused. We're against bad science, or we're against the misuse of science. If science was pure enough to direct everything we were doing, then, pro-life is pro-science. The data says it. The minute that the child is conceived, it is a human being. Is it what phylogeny does not recapitulate ontogeny? That's just, and it's still in some science books. That is physically wrong. Well, then someone says, yeah, but we don't think they're a person yet. When does that happen? Because when they're 1 day old, they're still as vulnerable as they are when they were in the womb, actually more so. So when do they become a person that has rights and defined rights and all that? And when do they become less of a person later on? No, science says it's a human being from day of conception. If the science led us, then all the information we have about the sexual liberation movement of the 60s, we got all kinds of data about how that's destroying relationships and it's creating all kinds of havoc. And it's also been bad for families, it's been bad for children, but nobody wants to hear that science because we just don't want to do the kinds of things we used to do about chastity and taking care of one another, putting others' cares above our own. We don't want to do that. Well, that's not science. That's a moral perspective on the data. And so again, those kinds of questions. And I even talked about how, right now we're looking for like a pill that's going to solve all our problems. And then I was reading this article about antibiotics and overuse of antibiotics. Again, if you think that the science is going to give us all the solutions, there are people who are popping these antibiotics like they're going to solve all their problems. They're actually creating bigger problems down the way. So science can't give us all the answers, but we want good scientific knowledge because we're going to use our sanctified common sense to put that knowledge to work for the sake of our neighbor. I just wrote, it's coming out on one of the Word for the Center Fridays, and it talks about Luther, and he wrote a piece called "Whether One May Flee During the Deadly Plague." So he's in the middle of the plague in 1527, and this is a violent thing. It's in many ways way worse than what we're experiencing now. And he writes compassionately. What I loved about, and you can go Google this online and see what he wrote. But what I love is he talked about how we're bound to our neighbors because of our faith, because of our sense of who they are as God's gift, and you can't be a Christian alone. And he was even telling people, if you have strong enough faith, then you stay with people in the middle of the crisis. And so they opened up their home to people who were sick with the plague. They ministered to people, even though it probably could have killed them as well. But I also loved what he said, and then he said, "And do not condemn those who could not bear what was happening with the plague and had to flee." And so even if you see someone fleeing and you think they should stay, have a humility about this. And I just love how he talks about this. Faith binds us, but it also gives us a sense of humility, so we don't even judge people when they're overcome by some of the things that we can handle and we can bear. So again, what a beautiful perspective. And that's a two-kingdom citizenship, sanctified common sense, faith perspective. And we're going to talk about that today. All right. I did also attend a webinar this week, and it was a webinar that was being done by all kinds of religious leaders and political leaders around the country. And there were a couple things that they talked about too. I think we're going to get to them in just a minute. But, they said, nope, we got to get over this politicization, this politicizing of this, because if this is a pandemic, then it's all hands on deck, and we got to keep focused on what we're doing so we can get past it. And I love one of the other things they said. He said, it's not that the pandemic makes us more dependent on God. It just exposes our need for Him more radically. When I was in New York City, we had a Bible study on Wall Street, and one of the things that they said about our Bible study was, they said we loved it because it was the same message before 9/11 as it was after. So it wasn't like we had this new message, like you better get right with God. No, you should have gotten right with God before, because there's all kinds of things. Death is the ultimate enemy. So, all the things we're facing, even in the pandemic, they're just a prelude of the real enemy. And so our message was Christ has dealt with that enemy, and then you can live boldly in this sinful, broken world because you're in Christ's hands. Our message did not change, even though the buildings, came crumbling down. And I think that's kind of the mindset we should have. So as we reopen, I would just tell you to go to the group that the president has assembled has put together some tremendous guidelines. Again, should be very helpful. You should keep those in mind. Sanctified common sense, wants knowledge. But again, these are the kind of things I thought we kind of practice these things. Wash your hands, avoid touching your face, sneeze or cough into a tissue or into your arm. I still see adults just letting it rip. Don't do that. You should never have done that, no matter what, even pre-pandemic. Disinfectant, used items and services. Here's where I gotta, it's not that I'm saying we shouldn't do that, but man, if you think we're gonna kill every bacteria, that's the wrong mindset too. And that's where I got with the antibiotic overuse. Like I said, we had people who thought, well, if you just took penicillin every time you felt bad, that you were just constantly going to be well and healthy. Actually, it makes you less healthy because it destroys your own immune system, which is exactly what God has given your body to fight all these things off. And there's good bacteria in your body. Now, this is a virus we're talking about, so and penicillin doesn't deal with that at all. But again, just the idea that we're going to have some pill or we're going to have something that's going to wipe all this stuff out. No, and you got to be careful that you're not living in fear then of making sure that every surface is clean to your satisfaction. Here's, my wife would say I'm not as clean as I should be. She's right. But at this point, I'm saying, but let's not be afraid of, like, I think, what did Trump call it, the silent killer? Yeah, it is, and you can't even see it coming sometimes. Well, live your life boldly, without fear, in the middle of that, because already your body's actually fighting those things off, and you didn't even know it. Okay. And then strongly use face coverings. Remember how this was so controversial at first? Nobody should do it. Now everyone should do it. Hey, let's not be these kind of violent, people. If we see somebody, let's wear the masks and let's practice the distancing like they're saying. But again, I've seen people do things with families who have to take their children to the store, and they overreact to this stuff. I've seen people, all by themselves in the park, or, out by themselves, and then we're hearing people are coming after them. And no, like Luther said, let's also have a sense of humility and humanity and just try to get through this thing together. Really, people who feel sick should stay home. I think that's the one thing about the pandemic we're starting to learn about COVID-19. It affects a certain part of our population more than anybody else. And in a certain part of the country even more than anybody else. I think it's 5 states have 60% of all the problems. There are some states that only have a handful, 100 people that have passed away from this, and and the whole state's still locked down. So, again, we're realizing that one size doesn't fit all, and we're moving forward. And so this is the personal reopening guidelines. Go look at the state reopening guidelines. Some people are locking down more than that, and we're going to talk about some of the overreach as well. Okay? All right, so faith, not fear. What should our next response be? Because we are people that are always seeking to honor God and to serve neighbor. It should be faith motivated, but here it comes, and morally directed. There are some folks who think that the church shouldn't have a voice in this stuff. They are absolutely wrong. The morally directed voice is the voice that God wants the church to have in the public realm for the sake of the civility and the preservation of the culture. And if we abdicate that voice, I'm telling you right now, there is a secular Puritanism in our culture that will replace. I don't believe we should be Puritans either. I mean, that's another view of Christianity that I don't want to get into today. But there's a secular Puritanism, where they define what you're supposed to do and what you're not to do. And if you violate that, they're going to make sure that you are punished. Well, we have a moral voice that's much different than that. It speaks the truth in love for the sake of everyone, not just ourselves. And we can defend why honoring father and mother is a very vital thing to our culture, not just to our church. We can defend the sanctity of life. We can defend keeping marriages together. We can defend, and here's the one I want to talk about today, the 8th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. Man, the last thing we should be doing as Christians is tattling on people. And we shouldn't be creating a culture of tattletales. And I'm sorry, if you're tattling on people, I remember in California, they had a rule that you couldn't even smoke a cigar outside in your backyard. There were some places where that would violate it, and people were turning each other in for that. It's not the kind of place you want to live. You just don't want to live in a culture like that. And why do constitutional protections really matter now? It's amazing to me how people are so willing to just give up their rights. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be suspending some of our activities, okay? But even there, I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm suspending something that I should be very nervous about giving up. Because someone else now is making decisions for what I'm supposed to do and what I'm not supposed to do. Maybe for a moment, but I don't want that to last very long. And so the DOJ has been very healthy on this. They've been saying that your rights do not go away, even in a pandemic. And I don't think this pandemic is worthy of the kinds of suspensions that we're seeing around the country beyond just the stay-at-home ones. But we'll talk about that today too. And then what actions? This is where we want to go today. Constitutional protections demand us to be good citizens. If they're going to protect our voice, then we should lift up our voice. And our voice should not just be to protect ourselves. It should be to benefit our neighbors. So let's see how we can fashion that voice today. Now, here's the last one I want to talk about today, faith and the public exercise of faith. Are these things essential or not? And God's people better be able to define that, because it will be defined for us. There are some people who are saying it's not essential. I'm going to talk about an example of that today. Well, what do we say, church? Now, the Constitution says something, but there are people who, if they can get away with not honoring the Constitution, they'll do it. A couple of the governors, it's been really interesting, when they've been asked, did you realize that when you made this order, you were suspending people's First Amendment rights? And a couple of them said, we didn't think about it. Hey, folks, that's why the First Amendment's there. Because, yeah, they generally don't think about it. Well, I thought I had to do that. Well, maybe not. And I have a role to play in whether that's something that you can do. Maybe you can do it for a moment, like curfew for this reason or that reason, or martial law for this reason or that reason. But you don't have martial law for the next 12 months. That just isn't going to work. And then remember, politics never can save us or solve these. One of the hardest things to learn is that politics is usually the last thing. It's the last bastion of support or protection. It never leads, folks. It never leads. And in a healthy, free society, it shouldn't. But that's kind of what we want to talk about then. Well, then what should we be doing? All right, remember again, we talked about God's unique way of engaging the world, and I give you the picture here of the angel Gabriel, or it could be like a knight, and the knight is keeping the evil things at bay, and that evil things includes our own sinful behavior and our own destructive behavior. He keeps that at bay so that the pastor can go up and preach the gospel freely. Preserving, saving. Preserving, saving. God preserves the world. This is where, when Governor Cuomo, I'm not picking on Governor Cuomo because I think he's doing a pretty good job. I'm not getting political here. But I don't know why he had to say God didn't do it. I just don't get that. We did it, he said. And I just thought, no, our human bodies are doing it first, Governor. And God gave us those antibodies and all the things that, all the capacity that we have, all of that stuff to be able to marshal all the private sector things and bring it to the aid of New York City. You think we did all that? God gave us that. You should have been thankful to God first. And then this is what we did, knowing that God had provided all these benefits. And then even someday when we have the vaccine, God provides that through the world that he has. I mean, this stuff's already out there for us to discover. I'm just saying that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be good families, good community, business, government, law enforcement, all that. But let's not overstate our activity. Even here, it's God at work. Remember when Pontius Pilate, says to Jesus, I can do whatever I want to you. And he says, the authority you have, that's even from above. And so there's going to even be a day of reckoning for how we use the political powers that we have, and the business powers that we have, and all the powers that we have, freedoms that we have. Okay, so this is God's way of engaging the world. Christian people then try to be faithful to God. The preserving work, remember we always said that's a what would the Father have us do kind of question. So there's verses like, God disciplines those who he loves. If you do not work, you do not eat. Those are the kind of things God says, that's because once you take away people's work ethic and things like that, it's not a good thing for society. That's a God the Father sustaining the world. Even though sinners are not saved by that work, their hearts may not be changed by that work, but the worst tendencies of sinful humanity are prevented from that. And so again, what would Jesus do? That's a how do we share the gospel kind of question. You mix those two questions up to your peril, and you actually make the church, you either politicize the church or you put the church in a corner where it doesn't belong. One of the people came out and said, our people are Matthew, I think she said Matthew 22, but it's Matthew 25. And that was the verse where it says, I was hungry and you fed me, and I was naked and you clothed me, and we believe in that. Well, that verse has nothing to do with government. It has nothing to do with the government taking money and providing it for other people. It has everything to do with you and me seeing people in need and using the resources we personally have. I always get really irritated when those same people who quote those verses and say, we did that by taking your money and giving it to somebody, then you find out that they don't give anything to charity. That just frosts me because, again, our founding fathers were more concerned for free people to put their resources and their lives to work for the sake of those in need. And we do have to honor Christ's moral work in the world. But that's not a government passage. That'd be like saying to the police, turn the other cheek. That's not the role of the police. That's the wrong question to ask for a policeman doing their duty. Now, that's the right question to ask about you and me serving a neighbor, turning the other cheek, giving the shirt off our back for the sake of sharing the gospel. Differentiate those questions. Preserving stuff is usually policy stuff, cultural stuff. Okay? Again, we had this before. I'm just putting it up here again because some of you are tuning in for the first time. But, honoring the suspension, clear reasoning. It's got to be clear reasoning. It's got to apply to all the same. The government's got to make their case for why they're able to do this for a time. And we're starting to see some of the reasonings not all that clear. Well, then you don't have the right to do some of the things that you're doing. And remember, as citizens, we're in a contract with these people. Yeah, we elect them, but then they have contractual responsibilities and limitations. And once they usurp those things, we have a representative, not a regal view of these kinds of things. Okay? And long-term solutions must never be government. We talked about that. So short-term willful compliance, we honor that clear reasoning, but we're always looking to return to fundamental rights and freedoms. And I would say fundamental exercise of our responsibilities. Maybe we should term it that way, because a lot of people are running around, my rights, my rights, my rights, and they don't really define, well, right to do what? To be a responsible human being for the sake of others. And that's what we want to be, okay? That's what we want to be. All right. We talked about the growing concerns that were out there. I don't want to get into too much because we talked about this last week. But, one of the things that we're seeing, and I actually gave, and I shouldn't have licked my fingers there, sorry about that. But I am by myself. But we've seen some of the heavy-handedness going on in some of the lockdown orders of some of these states. Compared to what they're dealing with, some of them seem to be out of step. Then others are moving forward pretty quickly, and people are a little uncomfortable with that too. Remember last week we said when you're in a sinful, broken world, sometimes the preserving issue is the lesser of two evils because there really is no good solution. Only in a two-kingdom way of thinking can you come to that. There are people saying, what's the right thing to do? In a lot of ways, we're saying, what's the least wrong thing to do? What's got the least consequences or ramifications? And so, we have 200 people are going to die if we don't just shut everybody down, but 22 million people are going to be out of work and the whole culture is going to settle. And that is going to be really damaging. And there's people going to die from that too. So, there was overreach. And I pointed a few of these out on our website. Pastor Martin, our Savior, I've seen some really good things from you Lutheran pastors. Keep up the good work. Where you've defined what you're going to do. You've kind of checked it out with your circuit council, your DP. Then you've actually gone to the law enforcement or even gone, to the politicians in your area. If you got aldermen, you can go. Just let them know what you're going to do. And yet, even having done all that and gotten permission to do that, there was still the tattletales. And they called the police. Now, in this case, the police did a great job, I think. They came there, saw that things were being done right, and then they said, Pastor, if someone comes after you, you let us know. But people are shaming this church, our Savior in Raleigh, North Carolina, and this is what we got to prevent. We got to prevent this nonsense. That's Eighth Commandment stuff. They're not putting the best construction. We got to actually demand that, too, of our citizenship. And so, again, we're with you, Pastor, and with you, the church. We've got other situations like that where pastors have tried to go through all the proper roles, and then the government just said, well, we're going to do what we want to do. And, there's the South Carolina church, and then there's the Mississippi church. There were people that were literally, they knocked on the window of their car, and they gave them $500 tickets, et cetera, et cetera. At least the Department of Justice says, that's a violation of their First Amendment rights. They're honoring all the stipulations we put out there. They have the right to do this, and they actually have a First Amendment protection to do this. Okay, so you can't do this. And there's lawsuits now that are coming to do that. I think you have to push back on this because there are some people saying, we're going to show you that the church is a non-essential thing, and we're going to single it out. We're going to leave liquor stores open. We're going to need lottery things open. We're going to leave restaurants open to do what they do, within these guidelines, but not the church? No. First Amendment protections were freedom of speech for you as a citizen and free religious liberty and religious exercise from a liberty standpoint. And then clear reasoning, we've seen some of the kind of convoluted ways. I'm just going to talk today about the greater threat. There's a greater threat than just the pandemic, and there's economic, sociological, but today we want to talk about the spiritual threat, and we want to be useful in God's hands. Remember last time we talked about Reformation restraint? We're practicing that. We're saying we're not going to go into this situation and want to tear down everything or want to just be a voice of negativity. We're a people who know God is doing good things even through people that we may not have voted for, or even through magistrates who may not be doing the best job or whatever. There's still we still got to say, wait a minute, what is God doing there, and what good can we build on from that? Because God is at work in all of this stuff to preserve it. And we also have vocational respect, seeking the truth, and we talked about that last time. If you want to know more about these, we have mom and pop papers on our website, lcrlfreedom.org, and you can read about that. But we've got to talk about having this mindset. Reformation restraint means we don't just go charging in and say, well, what would Jesus have us do? And we just do whatever we want to do. We say, no, what would the Father have us do? Because Jesus would honor the Father's work, even as he saves us. So what would the Father do? And we then come up with a more reasoned approach, and that we can debate with even non-Christians to our good, all of our good. All right, so what do we do? Again, having rehearsed again some of these fundamental principles, what do we do? What should our next response be? And this is where I really do love that we have 3 district presidents in Illinois, and I'm just going to read a little bit of what they sent. They sent this to the governor. And they talked about how we've abided by your recommendations, even during the most sacred week of the Christian church. We pray for you. But really what we're worried about is that you've removed the church from the list of essential activities. And listen to what they said. We're more than a food pantry or a transient assistance service. We prepare people to live now and for the life to come. So we're asking you to declare religious services as essential, and we'll find a way to abide by the distancing things as we move forward, but they have to be essential. And the governor ignored it. That's not a good thing. And so again, when you start to see this, our next response should be, no, you can't ignore our First Amendment rights. And my question is, if you have someone that you really love and they're in the hospital, they got COVID-19 and you know they're going to die, are you telling me that they can't have the last word from their pastor or from their family member who can read the good news of the gospel to them, pray the Lord's Prayer with them? Like the only thing they're going to hear is the person say, well, we can't do anything for them, just lock the door. I'm sorry, but if I can put the same mask on that the nurse has on, I can put the same gloves on, I can put the same smock on, and I can come in and I can pray with my people. That's a growing debate, because there are some people who say, well, you have no right. I don't think so. Why do we have medics and chaplains in battle? Because they're both essential. And the chaplain knows he's risking his life, just like the medic knows they don't have a gun either. For a reason, because they're not part of that. They're part of God's right-hand kingdom work, but they're right in the middle of all of this stuff too. And for us to let somebody tell us you're not, when we even have the constitutional protection to say we are, well, then that's on us. So there's going to be certain things we have to fight for, even as we try to serve people in the middle of this too. So our faith, moral worldview, and our constitutional protections. So our faith compels us to have a perspective. Our moral worldview propels us to have this, speak God's truth in love. But even our constitutional protections compel us to try to fashion our voice and our actions going forward. So faith, not fear. That's the first thing. When you hear someone say the doctor is the only real essential voice, as I told you about The Edge of Darkness, where there's this movie where there's this character who's kind of the cleaner. He just makes sure, if he takes care of things in a very brutal way when they have to be done. Well, he's sick, and at the very end, he's with the doctor, and the doctor's looking in his eyes, and he says, "Do you see a soul in there, Doc?" And the doctor said, that's not my business. If you need to see a counselor, you go see a counselor. He said, I just give you the facts. And he said, we all know what the facts are. We live a little bit, and then we die sooner than we planned. Well, that's not the only facts. And he was yearning to hear something else. And the doctor said, I can't tell you that. He's right. There's got to be someone else who tells you that. And that's Christ's message. That's God's message through the church. So how do we respond to the notion that worship and pastoral services are non-essentials? I think we have to push back on that. And I also think we have to push back on the fact that there are people who think that utopian solutions are going to solve all these problems. I just found it amazing. A couple of articles I read. The Kansas City Star had an article that said, coronavirus pandemic proves how much we need extended families. I agree. That's an incredibly good article. Okay? But in the same week, a feminist scholar, I just say researcher, she wants to abolish the family because she thinks our dependence on the government is the only thing we need and that we should even get rid of this thing called the nuclear family. She's crazy. But you're starting to see, well, wait a minute. There are two views out there. And there's one view that if we just get everybody involved with the government, all these things will be solved. That leads to tyranny. Historically, that leads to tyranny. I know free societies are usually messy, but free societies are much better for the sake of our freedoms. They're much better for entrepreneurship. They're much better for coming up with solutions to difficult problems. Yes, but we all have to take our part, take our role in that. Science and government are not the only data. And I think that's all I'm saying. We're not saying we're anti-science. In fact, as I said before, the Christian worldview kind of propelled the scientific method because people started to put their fingers in the dirt of life, if you will, because elites didn't do that historically before in other cultures. But it's because there was this idea of an orderly universe, a universe that could be studied, a universe that gave glory to God in its orderliness, and so science could start testing things that way. And the idea of purpose, like I said before, there are two worldviews kind of at war here. Is it survival of the fittest, or is it every person has dignity? Which one is it? Is it mercy? Which worldview actually do you want to practice in the middle of this pandemic? So what to do? Fight and contend for the right to maintain the church's voice. We're in D.C. to do that with you. We're an advocate in D.C., but we need you to be a part of this with us. And when I say fight, I mean contend for it with humility, without contentiousness. But you gotta actually take up that role as a citizen in this country. I'll give you an example. I was on a panel that was going on, and this is about an issue on immigration. And we have church people on both sides of this issue, so it's pretty hard, people say, what does the Lord say? Well, there's some truth to that, and there's some truth to that. And so I'm on this panel. At the very end, someone asked, how can we overcome all this? And the rabbi got up and said, and I love this answer, he said, if we would just treat each other as made in the image of God, we might be able to get past some of these divides. So the question was, what should I say? Because I agreed with that. Should I just let that stand? Well, I just raised my hand and said, I really agree with that, but here's my question to all of you. And there were a lot of people in there, a lot of staffers. There was even some high representatives from offices in the Capitol. I said, how come the rabbi and I can't say that, or even you can't say that in a public university, in a public forum? You'll get an F on your paper, no matter what you're studying. If you say, I believe there's a God, and I have inherent dignity because I'm created in His image. So again, we need to let our voice be heard. Now, as I said before, I always ask people, what do you think the response of that room was to the rabbi's point? He got a standing ovation. Most people think people were like, harumph. No, there's an inherent, people know this is the right way to go forward. The chaplains and the medics in the middle of the battle, be there. And then, like I said, a different mindset. Do we have a mindset of mercy that looks in people suffering and sees how we can be God's agent in their lives, even if we wind up suffering along with them? Or survival of the fittest? Hey, that's just nature saying it's time to get rid of the weak. Which one is it? I don't hear a lot of Darwinianism right now on the television. Exercise, okay, so that's defending our rights. That's contending. But if you're contending for them, your First Amendment rights compel to be active. So we speak His truth in love, with a humility, because we're just as broken as the people that we're trying to share God's wisdom with. 2 Peter, I love this verse, add to your faith goodness, to goodness knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, godliness, kindness, and love. Become a person of virtue. And this is usually when you start to see people either become virtuous, or you can see that they have a disdain for humanity. So what a powerful statement there. But speak God's truth in love, and then be the kind of person who strives to be useful in God's hands. And even non-Christians can strive for a certain amount of these things: knowledge, self-control, perseverance. But only faith is going to finally get us to the point where we have this agape love that lives in us towards others. Psalm 146, I will praise the Lord while I live, while I have my being. So my life is not my own, and so mark the days that you're not going to be on this earth forever, no matter what, because sin has ravaged our world and ravaged our own lives. That's why Christ came and died, lived and died, and rose again for us. But mark your days. And so while you have life, be the kind of person who goes about their business as a two-kingdom citizen for the sake of others. Don't trust in princes, the psalmist says. Don't trust in mortal men, because there's no salvation in them. Because their spirit, as soon as they depart, it's gone in terms of their wisdom dies with them, if you will. So again, some other verses. Now here's the one I would say, we've talked about the third commandment. Remember the Sabbath day, should we be worshiping as part of that debate? Honor your father and your mother, family as part of God's preserving aspect of the world. And I do think extended family. I've got something coming out on that too. And how, gosh, we should be looking to each other first for these kinds of protections and things to move forward. And then the sanctity of life, we've talked about that. It's very distressing to see the abortion industry being treated as an essential thing at this moment. So in the middle, we're killing the most innocent among us, and we're even starting to look with askance at people who are older who get COVID-19, because both of those come out of a utilitarian view of humanity, that if they're not useful to humanity, well, shouldn't we be able to get rid of them? And there's more and more Western countries talking that way. That should scare us. And then the eighth commandment, this is about the tattletale stuff. Put the best construction. Do you actually know what's happening? And again, tattling first, sicking the dogs on, putting the police in the middle of these things first. So again, these are commandments that should guide our moral engagement of these issues. And then see the big picture. The big picture is not just that there are physical, social, economic things going on. Eternal lives are at stake too. And care more for more than just for the physical person. We've talked about that. Look to family, church, community. But here's what we've been talking about today. Fashion your faith knowledge plan. So you think about, what should we be doing? That's exercising your liberties, getting all the information that you can have and moving forward. And to some degree, you're starting to see, governors, people are waiting for governors to tell them what to do. That's not the way we do things. Now, in a crisis, we look to them first because that's their role. But as we move forward, we need to take upon ourselves, we start to risk living life for the sake of others. Again, within these guidelines, with a healthy mindset, a sanctified common sense. But you start to think, what should we be doing? And don't wait for them to tell us what to do, because some will tell us things that actually are not in our best interest or in the interest of others. I tried to answer most of the questions in the context of our discussion today. But one of the questions that came up is, should we even be talking about this? I mean, is it too early? And I understand that. And like I said before, when you have lesser of two evils discussions, it's hard to say right now. But as we get longer into this self-quarantine, it's really ironic to think about that all the healthy people that are in our culture have been shut down. Period. And then to try to see, well, who should we allow? Because we're allowing some people to still deliver the goods and to cut the grasses and to do some of the takeout stuff. We're allowing stores to be. What's the reasoning behind all of this, and why is your spiritual need? Why are those things superfluous? Now, we're a sacramental church. We can do online stuff for a time, but 2 or 3 gathered, this is going to be moving forward. We're going to have to really care for each other moving forward, but it's tough to be church when you're not together and gathered together. So your family gathers, and then your spiritual family gathers, and so moving forward, we're going to have to work through that, because our theology, the real presence of Christ, kind of calls us to think this through on a very, very deep level. One of those, Lewis asked the question, do we think using the common cup is testing the Lord right now? Okay, that's a church practice question. I'll put my 2 cents in there with it. It's kind of the same thing with any disease as we've had before. The common cup, is it any more safe than another? There's a sense where churches offer both and people then make the decision. It's not unsanitary, but, for a time, I suppose. But again, the fears that are in this world, we should never let that finally determine our practice. And so even if we have this situation for a time, I don't see it finally changing ultimately how we do the things that are precious to us. And the Word and the sacraments are precious to us. So again, that probably get me a little bit of trouble, because it's still not a definitive answer. And most churches even now practice both, and they allow people then to kind of be open to either one. And if their faith is not such that they can feel confident about the sanitariness. But I see pastors constantly wiping, constantly cleaning their hands and these kinds of things. And going forward, I think churches can make those decisions in Christian freedom, also in service to neighbor. Okay? So again, I hope you begin to see that. I think we're called to move forward, and the goal is to make sure that we start to see that our religious liberty is an essential thing. Now, we think that as Christians, no problem. But our culture and our Constitution actually defined America that way too. And that's what we've got to also contend for, is that there are a lot of people who don't think that's important anymore. No, the Founding Fathers, they really believed that religious exercise, faith in people's lives as free citizens, that was supposed to be the big thing, and the government was supposed to be kind of the bottom. I've got a mom and pop paper on this one. It's called, "It's Bad When the Referees Play the Game." They're the referees. We play the game. We're in the game of life. We love our families. We love our neighborhoods. We love our friends, our neighbors, and even those we disagree with. And everything we're trying to do, we're trying to say, this is who God is for you and for us. We're not just saying protect our voice. We're saying, well, we want to get this voice, His 2-kingdom voice out there, His preserving, saving voice out there. And if you've ever watched a basketball game where the refs start calling too many fouls, you can't watch it. It's terrible to watch when the refs are the ones actually playing the game. It's not their job. And that's the role of government, I think, in our constitutional protections. They have a role, and our Founding Fathers even made sure that they didn't get overzealous with that, because they set up the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch to keep each other honest. But they're the refs. We have to be the ones that jump into the game of life for the sake of our neighbors. So again, forward by faith, not by fear. Please be encouraged. And if you want to sign up for our LCRL, just text LCRL to 444-999, and you will receive a Monday devotion that I think will uplift your spirit, give you hope, and then a Friday kind of op-ed that applies some of this 2-kingdom way of thinking to these issues. Stay informed. Visit our webpage at lcrlfreedom.org, and as you're able, because we live by the grace of the people who are out there, and thank God you've been supporting us still in the middle of all this. We're in nobody's budget, so we have a place where you can go to LCMS Give Now LCRL to donate to us, to keep us as your voice in D.C., advocating for these things, encouraging those who are doing a great job in D.C. to protect your liberties, but also coming out to educate and to kind of empower you to be 2-kingdom citizens. I'm Gregory Seltz. It's been so good to be with you, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.